Hey, so this is our Google Hangout, our last one of the year, with the New World Symphony. Just thought we'd introduce ourselves before we introduce participants and the topic and all that fun stuff. So my name's Jarrett, and I'm the tuba fellow here at the New World Symphony. This is my first year, and I was born in Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
I'm Zach Manzi. I'm a clarinet fellow. It's my first year, and I'm from Colorado Springs, Colorado.
My name is Josh Cote. I'm a first-year French horn fellow, and I was born in Fort Worth, Texas, but grew up outside of Chicago.
Cool. So now that you know us, before we introduce the participants and our special guest, just thought we would talk about NWS Connect. So NWS Connect is a great platform for middle school and high school students. If you're not familiar, I'm sure most of you are familiar, but it's a great platform for those students. And you can check out NWS Connect on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And throughout the chat, you can also use the chat function on Mosaic. So if you want to submit a question for us to answer, we're going to check that periodically and kind of answer questions as we go. And additionally, you can follow NWS Connect on Twitter and use hashtag NWS Hangout to submit questions as well. So now that you know that, let's move on to introducing some of our participants. So why don't we start with Nicole, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Nicole. I'm a business student, started grad school at Ithaca College. I run a flute blog called Flute Girl Life, and I just started working for Rob Knopper over at Audition Hacker.
Cool. That's really nice. So, sorry, I missed where you, so you're at Ithaca College, and what year are you in at Ithaca?
I'm in an off semester right now. I'm going to start there in the fall, and I'll be a grad student.
Cool. And where are you now? Sorry.
Columbia, South Carolina.
Columbia. Okay, sorry, I didn't hear that. And who's your friend?
I'm Sam Breitenbach. I'm a violin performance graduate from USC here in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm heading towards an off semester while I figure out what the next step is.
Awesome. Well, it's really nice to have you. And then we can get an introduction from Katie as well.
Hi, I'm Katie. I live in Oregon, and I play the violin, and I'm in 9th grade.
Awesome. It's nice to have you back, Katie. Katie is kind of like our resident, has been most of the Hangouts. Yeah, exactly, resident participant. So it's really nice to have you. So thanks a lot for coming. And so we're going to have participants kind of jump in as the Hangout is going. So we'll introduce them as that kind of goes on. So I thought we'd take a second to introduce Noah now. So our special guest for this topic, so our topic for this chat, I'll talk about that first, is playing under pressure. So we're going to talk about basically something that we all feel when we're about to perform is nerves and how they affect our performance and how we can kind of get control of it so that we can have the best performance we've prepared for. So our guest for this is Dr. Noa Kageyama, who is on faculty at Juilliard and is also on faculty here at the New World Symphony, and runs a terrific blog, if you haven't seen it, called The Bulletproof Musician, and is essentially an aficionado of all things performance practice and everything. So Noah, if we could just get you to introduce yourself and talk about your background a little bit, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I started off as a violinist. I was 2.5, and apparently it was my idea to get started with violin or some kind of musical instrument. And actually, you mentioned Ithaca College. That's where I started. It was summer of, I think, 1978 or something like that. I learned how to bow and hold a violin, and that's how I spent my summer at Ithaca College. I have some family connections, which is why I was there, and they were starting off a Suzuki program as well. So things kind of took off from there. When I was 5, my mom took me out of kindergarten. We flew over to Japan. I studied with Dr. Suzuki for about 6 months, Then I came back, and then it was lessons a couple times a week, and that turned into lots of driving and lots of teachers all over the place. And I just followed the path to conservatory and the music career that I assumed would be in my future, like a lot of other young musicians do. Summer festivals, competitions, and so on. And then, college was fine. I, went through college, and then for grad school, I went to Juilliard, and that's about the time when I started having this conversation in my head of, what am I going to do when I'm done here, right? Because I could see the end coming. During college, I didn't think about it. Grad school, I was like, uh-oh, okay, this is not, I can't stay a student forever. I got to do something when I grow up. And so I started trying to figure it out. And at the time, a couple things came together. One, I was in this quartet. We just did gigs. It wasn't anything serious. But we had this conversation one day as we're walking around about what we'd do if we won the lottery. And I knew what my plan would be post-lottery, and that would be to not play the violin again. Just put it away and not play it. And the other three in the quartet had other music-related plans, and that totally baffled me. I was like, well, why? Like, why wouldn't you quit? You don't have to play the cello or the violin or the viola anymore. And it was just, I didn't say this out loud, but it was weird to me that they would still play their instruments. It turned out I was the weird one. As I talked to more friends, it's like, no, why would you quit? Like, you just do more cool stuff. Like, you wouldn't have to worry about things as much. And so I was like, I should probably think about this a little bit. And then simultaneously, I was taking this class at Juilliard called Performance Enhancement. It was sports psychology for musicians. And, I'd always grown up assuming that nerves were part of the equation and that performances would always be hit or miss. And I didn't like that. It was very frustrating to get on stage and not sound like yourself. But I just assumed that that's what would happen. And at some point, maybe it would go away. Well, it hadn't gone away to that point. And so this class was opening my eyes to a whole scientific literature on how to perform your best under pressure when it really matters. And so that was really fascinating to me and helpful as well. So that combined with this whole lottery question made me think that, well, maybe I should consider some other things in the field of music. And so when I was done at Juilliard, going back to school and prolonging school, but also to study sports psychology seemed like the most intriguing option that I could think of. And so that's kind of how I got started down that path and led me to be here with you guys tonight.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for that. Zach or Josh, do you guys have any follow-up questions about that stuff? You want to start?
Yeah, I guess for aspiring musicians, everyone generally wants to get better at their instrument. Where do you start? Every morning we wake up and we, need to play, and where do you begin? Do you begin where you left off the day before, or how do you define goals, basically? I found in my own experience, defining goals has really kind of raised my game and my, drive. Can you talk about maybe some goals? You talked about goals in your own professional life, but maybe we can bring it back to, aspiring musicians and talk about goals long-term, short-term, medium-term, and the importance of them.
Sure. I think the way that I typically practiced growing up is I just woke up, started playing, and whatever sounded the worst is what I would work on, or whatever, actually, not even whatever sounded the worst. Whatever I happened to screw up first is what I started working on. And then I moved to the next mistake and the next one and so on. And so I didn't really have a particular strategy for practicing. So that's why, like in grad school, I once spent a month just working on the first page of the chaconne, the unaccompanied chaconne for violin by Bach. And then got to a competition and realized that I knew the first page pretty well, but the rest of it not so much. And I paid the price for that. So I think your question about priorities is really spot on. I like, at this point, to think of prioritization as being performance-centric or audition-centric, but essentially performance-centric, where I identifying the next performance opportunity or the next audition or the next time you're going to have to actually play something. It might be a lesson, it might be studio class, it might be orchestral audition or summer festival audition or just a recital. And kind of working backwards from that to figure out what are the biggest things you need to work on in order to play at a level that you're going to be happy with at that particular thing. And it might be a week out, it might be 6 months out, but based on where you know you need to be in 3 months, in 2 months, in 1 month, in 2 weeks, etc. It's a lot easier to kind of chunkify, if you will, the main things you need to work on in weekly increments or even daily increments and see how you're doing based on the trajectory that you're kind of creating for yourself.
Yeah, that's some great points.
I have a question following up from that, Noah. This was actually something that we talked about here. I was getting ready for an audition, and you came in at exactly the right time because it was like 4 weeks out from the audition. And I said to you, I've always approached auditions in the same way. I start from not knowing some of the excerpts, having played some of them, but starting playing them slowly, starting to get into it maybe during the first week when I'm 4 weeks out. Second week, putting the tempo up a little bit more. Third week, a little bit more. Fourth week, a little bit more. So it's a constant arc from beginning to end. But when you talked about a method that was a little bit different, that involved sort of making each week a chunk of work and doing mock auditions because I was preparing for an audition, or mock performance if you're preparing for a performance. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because that was something I'd never heard before.
Sure. This is the idea of having an iterative approach to learning music, and whether each iteration is a week, as it might have been in your case, or each iteration could be a month. The idea is to take a piece of music or an excerpt and get it to a playable level, and then refine it, and then that changes things. And then, so maybe a better way of explaining this would be to kind of back up. And some of you may be familiar with Kageyama, the famous violin pedagogue who's responsible for a whole generation of musicians like Perlman and Zuckerman. And he once wrote in this book that there are 3 elements of practice, right? We should be spending our time about equally in each of these 3 areas. The first one is conceptual, right? So we need to figure out what we want something to sound like first, whether it's a sonata, concerto, an excerpt. If we don't have a concept for what we're going for, we could play it or practice it, but it's not necessarily in the best use of our time because we're going to have to relearn it in a different way at some point in the future. So the first part is conceptual. The second part is mechanical. So once we know what we want something to sound like, with score study or listening to recordings or just kind of figuring it out as we play through it, we need to be able to actually execute and make those things happen. And that's where we tend to get stuck. We sometimes skip the conceptual stuff. We just go to mechanical. We just try to play the notes that are on the page with the rhythms and the markings that are there. And then we figure, oh, once I get the notes down, then I'll add some music into it. But by then, it's a different piece, right? Playing it very generically and straight is a different piece than playing it with inflection and all the nuances that we want. So it's a slightly modified set of motor skills, so we've created more work for ourselves. And then the third element that Kalamian described, he said we usually wait until it's too little and too late. And this is a performance element. So once we have a concept, once we can produce it reliably, technique-wise, well, we have to be able to produce it in its entirety in a performance-like manner. Not just one phrase in isolation or one page in isolation, but the whole thing from beginning to end in performance-like situations. So the idea with this iterative approach to practicing is to make sure that we don't go through this sequence in order, because then we're waiting to do all this performance preparation at the very end when it's a little bit too late, but to kind of go through this 3-stage cycle continuously so that by the time we get to performance, everything, not just our ability to perform it, but play it consistently in performance-like pressure situation is kind of growing the entire time that we're working on something.
Right, yeah, and that's actually exactly how I felt, and I emailed you about this, but just so everybody listening knows, that was the very first time, I think, in an audition I felt actually comfortable playing on stage, 100% comfortable. And I think it was because exactly what you're saying, I had done it so many times before. I did 3 or 4 mock auditions and prepared like I was preparing for the actual audition each time. So by the time I got to that audition, it was like I had done it already so many times before that that it just felt like I was doing it another time in a different place. So I think as far as being under pressure in that situation, it was a source of comfort to know that I'd done it and I'd done it successfully before several times. So I think it worked.
Right. And there's actually a fairly straightforward reason why it might have been helpful. There's a well, I guess he's well known in diving circles, but the former Olympic diving coach for the U.S. Olympic diving team in 2000, 2004, and 2008, his name is Jeff Huber, and he often tells his diver, or used to when he was coaching, that he had two jobs, two very specific, concrete jobs. One was to teach them how to perform better, and the second was to teach them how to perform better under pressure. And he said that those are two qualitatively different activities, require different methods of preparation. And if you just think about the difference between practicing and performing, when you're practicing effectively, like just one element that's different about practicing and performing is when you're practicing effectively, you're self-monitoring, right? You're listening to yourself, listening for mistakes. You're trying to identify, what do I need to make better? So you're constantly critiquing and kind of reflecting as you're playing. When you're performing effectively, you can't do that, right? Like if you're constantly self-monitoring and judging and analyzing and critiquing as you're playing, you're constantly feeling bad about what's happening, and you're essentially in the past. Instead of being out in front, creating what it is that you want to say, you're kind of reacting to what it is that you've already said that you can't even change anymore. So that's why he says there are two very different tasks, and that's just one piece of it. So if you've saved practicing how to get into that performance mindset until like the last few days or last week, you're not going to be very good at it, especially under pressure. But if you've been practicing that on a regular basis all throughout your preparation, you continue to get better and better and better at flipping that switch between practice mode and performance mode, so that when you do get to the audition or the performance, you've gotten to a much higher level in your ability to perform and execute in that sort of way.
Yeah, I think that's really great, and I have a few things to add, just basically that Noah has taught me this year. They kind of go along with what Zach was saying. Two things that he kind of, and Noah, you can elaborate on this, but the two things that you said that really helped me kind of maintain like a very strong level of focus throughout kind of when you're performing is the first was singing brain approach. I don't know if you remember talking about that, but basically what that was that when you're playing, you feel as though you're kind of singing your way through the excerpt, and it kind of just like keeps your brain totally engaged while you're performing. And similarly, there's this other approach called, well, it's kind of an improvisatory approach to the excerpt, and it doesn't mean kind of like throw out like all your preparation, but it basically means just like maybe change a few of the breathing spots that you had originally planned to, or change the dynamic a little bit, just to keep kind of your brain like totally engaged throughout the performance of the excerpt. And I mean, when you brought those things up, it like definitely helped me, because focus was a big thing for me when I was preparing for a couple auditions this year.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, it's sort of paradoxical that the more well-learned our repertoire is, by definition, the less cognitive resources are required to execute those, right? When you're learning something absolutely new, you have to concentrate with every fiber of your being in order to be able to keep up. Let's say you're sight reading an orchestra. But once you know a piece like the back of your hand, you can play it in your sleep, which is great, except that your brain doesn't have to work very hard. And so it's going to look for other things to do. And under pressure, it's going to look for unhelpful things like worrying about what other people are thinking, or the really difficult section that's coming up way in advance, or reflecting on what just happened and you can't believe why that happened, or just even random things like thinking about what you're going to eat for lunch afterwards. And so we need to be able to occupy our mind with something that's actually relevant and helpful. And this is a new thing that I started making people do just because I think it's entertaining. But and those of you listening in, you can do this as well. But inside your head, and maybe the three of you can be guinea pigs for now, but inside your head, sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm, right? So that way we don't have to worry about synchronizing animals. Just inside your head, sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm, but simultaneously, out loud, count backwards from 100 by 3.
All right. Okay. So you want to do it? Okay. All right.
Yeah, give it a try.
All right. 100,
97, 94,
91, 88, 85.
No.
Yeah.
No, you can't.
Did you do it?
I like stopped.
I can't do it. Sorry.
Well, even if you do the, how did Old MacDonald go in your head as you're doing that?
I got lost. Yeah.
Yeah, I was way better at counting. I don't know.
It's hard to do both simultaneously, right? Like either Old MacDonald kind of suffers and you stumble and you forget where you are, or the counting is either stilted or just wrong. We could have done, counting backwards from 6. That would have made it even more difficult. 3 is not so bad. But yeah, we can't really do a whole lot of things all at the same time. And you guys can sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm in your sleep. So the idea is to occupy your thoughts, like Jarrett was saying, either by singing internally, almost as a way of like vocally conducting what it is that you already know how to do and your body knows how to do. You just need to kind of keep your mind engaged with it. Or this sort of micro-improvisatory approach is just to add little tiny special touches and nuances from here, here or there. Just an extra half wiggle of vibrato, or just elongating your sound ever so slightly, or ever so slightly leaning forwards or leaning backwards, or going to a different section. I mean, there's an infinite range of really subtle, tiny things that we can do that are different from performance to performance, which we would do anyway, but almost by accident as opposed to on purpose. But if we are cognitively engaged in trying to create that as we go, based on the overall template of what we've already decided, it allows us to stay engaged with what it is that we're trying to say, even if it's something we've played for 20 years.
Yeah, totally. That's so great. Anyway, so I kind of just wanted to prompt some of our participants to see if they have any questions. Maybe Nicole, did you have anything you wanted to ask Noah?
I think she has her mic.
Okay.
Oh, wait, there she.
Oh, we're good now. Yeah, I guess I'm starting at school in the fall, and over the summer, I'm not going to have a professor or anyone kind of looking over my shoulder and making sure I'm learning things. So I guess I'm worried that I'm going to be learning these pieces over the summer and learning them wrong, because it's like I have all of these skills as a musician, like I can know how a piece sounds, but like I'm afraid that when I actually put it in front of a teacher, they're going to rip it apart, and it's going to be like all of this work that I tried to do by myself over the summer is gone. So I guess my question is like, when you're trying to do these like self-reflective things and like learning these pieces, and like you all know like kind of out of school how difficult that is. So like how do you kind of build up that confidence to like trust yourself that like you are doing the right thing?
That's a great question. Every musician goes through a time where they're internally like, oh crap, like what am I supposed to do? Right? I look at a brand new piece of music or this fresh score, I've never even heard it before. Like, how do I know the right way to play this phrase or the right way to play this note, or what fingering I should use, like all these things, what's the right sound? I would say that actually this summer you can't screw anything up, because what you're trying to develop is this ability to teach yourself, right? And so you've just finished undergrad, you're in a good place where you can try to test out all the things that you've learned to this point. And obviously, after grad school in 2 years, you'll have even more ideas, even more insight, even more experience to be able to teach yourself better, and then in 10 years, even more so. My moment of realizing that I didn't know what I was doing was I think after my sophomore year, we went to this chamber music workshop in Israel, and all these great artists were there, Isaac Stern, Leon Fleischer, and at that point, I was just learning music by kind of going by instinct and going off of recordings that I'd heard and just doing whatever seemed to sound better. But I didn't really have a pretty strong appreciation for how to use the music theory that I'd taken and actually apply it to making decisions in the music. And so when they asked me, why was I doing it this way? Why did we do it this way? We didn't really have very good answers other than it seemed better or it sounded better. So this summer when you go through learning repertoire, I think the main thing to do is to practice making decisions, right? So if there's a note and you need to figure out, should in this sequence, should this be louder or softer? Just make a decision and have a reason to back it up, based on what else is in the score. And I think as long as you've made decisions consciously, not just based on simply what seems to sound better in the moment, but there's also rationale behind it. And then you go and you meet your teacher in the fall. I think some of those things, he or she may say, yeah, well, have you also considered this or looked at this part of it? And you might be like, huh, that's a good point. I hadn't, and that actually makes more sense. But there might be other things where he or she says, I could see an argument for that. I wouldn't do it that way, but you seem to have a good rationale, and I can buy that. But the big thing I think you'll gain out of the summer is what you were asking about, just confidence and being able to trust your own judgment. I mean, because what you'll probably do is you'll go with intuition first. Be like, what sounds better, what feels better, what seems like the right thing to do. And then if you can back it up with some actual tangible reasons, then that's where you start to gain confidence and trusting your own judgment.
Do you guys have anything else?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Noah, if you don't mind, those are all really, really great points to answer Nicole's question. Nicole, I was actually in the exact same situation this time last year. Because I was finishing school and I had the whole summer off. I also had some of the same worries. First of all, what am I going to do? Am I going to practice at all? That was one of the questions I was asking myself. And so I thought about it for a while, and I decided that it was a really great opportunity to decide how I wanted to sound and why. So it ended up being really liberating because I'd practice most days, not for that long, a couple hours maybe. But the whole time, rather than thinking about how I would have played it for my teacher in undergrad, I was thinking about how I would play it for myself, based on recordings I've heard and things that I liked in those recordings, or even just looking at the score and really deciding musical choices based on what's there in the score. So I think you'll find it to be really exciting to be able to do that and be that free. And then you'll take a lot of conviction to your next teacher, and that's a really impressive thing, to have conviction about why you're playing the music the way you are. So I think I hope you'll find it to be as liberating as I did.
Yeah, no, I just to go off of that, I think there's this sometimes overwhelming pressure to do a crazy summer festival or go play with the Berlin Philharmonic or something during the summer. But some of my most productive summers have been not doing a festival and taking some time off and getting a head start on some new repertoire for the fall or things like that. And I mean, summer festivals, especially the long ones, are so busy and so involved, and it's hard to get better as a musician during that because you're learning all this new rep and you're just trying to do what you need to do to sound good in the festival. Whereas if you have a couple of months off, or at least a couple of weeks off in the summer, you can really focus in and do some work on some things that you've kind of maybe been putting off, or something that you've struggled with for a while. Josh, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would just say, at the end of the day, you are the only teacher that will teach yourself your entire life. Just don't be afraid of, I guess, making decisions like Noah said. I mean, when you study with someone, in a way, they are bending your playing to their experience and their own playing. And so I noticed with myself, with my different teachers, I started to pick things, almost sound like them in different ways. But now at New World, where I don't have a teacher, it's actually, I think I'm getting better faster in a way, because I'm forced literally to make decisions by and justify my decisions, rather than just allow a teacher to bend my playing into his definition of success, his success and his definition of what sounds good.
Yeah.
And you can also take into account everything that you've gotten from previous teachers that you've liked.
Yes.
And you take everything and mix it together for your own.
So I was going to say, now that when I practice, I've had enough input from enough teachers that they're all kind of ringing in my head in different spots, and you kind of pick and choose from all your experiences to form your own definition of playing.
Yeah, that's really great. Noah, do you have anything to add?
The only other thought I had was this is where it can be helpful to play for lots of different people, not just because you want to find out who has the best answer or the right answer, because they're all going to have different answers and different ways of justifying why they feel theirs is the right approach. And then so you don't have to pick necessarily, Well, actually, no, that's the whole point. Then you get to pick. You get to decide, okay, which one makes the most sense to me. And reflecting back, growing up, I always had lots of influences. I think for most of my life, I always had at least 2 different teachers. At one point, I had 4 different teachers all at the same time, like in a few different states and different cities. And so I was constantly having to decide which one I actually agreed with the most. So this sort of practice at deciding and making decisions, I think, was kind of part of my training, for better or for worse. And so now, if you have the opportunity to just play for other people over the summer, just to kind of see what their thoughts are, not that you have to listen to them, just to get an expanded range of possibilities that can help stretch your thinking as well. But most importantly, ask them why. Not to be annoying, but just so you get a sense of their thought process and how they came to that, which is going to help inform how you think about coming to different decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, developing musical independence, I guess. Katie, did you have anything you wanted to ask Noah or ask us or anything?
So I was playing a concert with my quartet the other day, and like I missed a page turn because, well, I left myself like too little of time to actually turn the page. But like by the time I was able to turn the page, like I was all shaky and like really nervous, and so it was affecting like how I could play once I actually had the music again. So like how do you like get calm faster like once you're all shaky and stuff?
That's a good question. I think we've all had moments where, whether it's a page turn or sudden fear of having a memory slip or just a note that totally got messed up, like the adrenaline kicks in and we start freaking out a little bit internally. So this is where performance anxiety or the adrenaline response is really interesting. I think because it feels so disruptive and unpleasant how we feel internally, we like to try to get rid of that feeling as soon as possible. And it makes perfect sense to do that, but there's actually a lot more going on in that moment. And we're perfectly capable most times of playing quite well, regardless of how we feel inside. The problem with us feeling that way is it usually sucks our attention along with it. So if we start feeling that sort of feeling inside, our mind goes to that feeling and how unpleasant it is and how we're going to screw up and, you know, do other people hear my bow starting to shake and what's going to happen if this person hears this or did they notice that? Like we start basically going down this downward spiral of doom, mostly internally with our thoughts. So when something like that happens, actually part of what is great about performance practice and playing more often is becoming increasingly comfortable with being uncomfortable physically. Because very rarely, if ever, are you going to have a concert or performance or audition that feels completely comfortable physically. You can still have an amazing performance. It just doesn't have to necessarily coincide with physical comfort. So one of the first things you want to do when something like that happens is make sure you're not tensing up physically. Because a lot of times when our body kicks into gear like that, there's a tendency for us to get tight. Like your shoulders might go up or your arms might get tight. You just almost like get into this freeze kind of a mode. So you want to make sure that your muscles are still loose. You drop your shoulders, keep your arms loose, keep your left hand loose. And then the next thing you want to do is make sure you're not thinking about the mistake that just happened or the situation that you're in, but instead focus on what is it that you're trying to do, right? So blending with your quartet mates or making sure you're cueing together or trying to match sounds or strokes or keeping your mind focused on what you're about to play and what you're trying to say as opposed to what could happen or what just did happen. And essentially it's just those two things. You want to match the physical response and match the mental response. You know, there are other things that sometimes happen too when we make mistakes. Like some people have a tendency to try to be particularly heroic, right? So you just made a mistake. It's like, oh, that sucks. Now I need to do something spectacular. So you try to do something super crazy awesome. And in doing so, when you're already kind of tight and feeling uncomfortable, we dig ourselves a deeper hole. So you want to avoid trying to be a hero in those moments. And you want to avoid trying to figure out what just happened. right? And because you can figure out the page turn thing later. In that moment, just get back to the present, make sure your muscles are loose, and try to connect, especially in an ensemble situation, just connect with what other people are doing. If it's just you playing unaccompanied Bach, connect with the sound that you're trying to create. But the most important thing is to stay in the moment and not let that derail you.
Makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah. Katie, this is a really good question. And Noah had some really great answers for you. Going off what he said, there's actually this TED Talk, something about, have you guys seen this? It's about making stress your friend, or stress is not as, I forget what it's called. But if you look up TED Talk stress, I'm sure it'll be the first one that comes up. And it talks about how, or the woman giving the talk talks about how adrenaline and stress and the way your body reacts to it is actually an evolutionary process that helps you. For example, if you were living in 2000 BC and there's a woolly mammoth that comes up to you and is going to eat you, you're probably going to get stressed out, and that's your body helping you be able to run away, right? So no more woolly mammoths, but we have now performance anxiety and stress. And so the way I try to look at it, and either just thinking about it or in the moment, is that that's my body helping me to recover from whatever just happened. And so you can't really think about it that quickly maybe when you're in a performance, but if you can think about taking that energy that suddenly bubbles up and putting it into the exact moment that you're in, as Noah said, that could be an effective way of getting through something like that. And that takes practicing that, just going through performances when that happens, and trying to do that. Over time, it'll get a lot easier.
Do you think at the bottom of it, it really you have to have an extremely strong concept to fall back upon, for you to be able to like use that energy? If you don't have a concept, something to like concentrate on.
Yeah, you bring yourself.
Did everything freeze up, or are the rest of you guys still there? Can you hear me? Can you give a thumbs up if you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Do you guys want to continue with another question while they get their internet back up and working?
Yeah. I am listening to all this. I am the type of person who can get really fixated on small details, and so hearing about like a conceptual approach to music, a mechanical approach to music, a performance approach to music, I can take a practice session and get so fixated on one note, and then, oh my god, it sounds wrong, how do I fix it? And I keep trying to fix it, and eventually I just no longer have the rest of the image in mind. And so if I have a summer to myself to work, kind of like Nicole does, how do I get around that?
That's a great question. You know, for what it's worth, you're not alone in that. That is a tendency for a lot of folks, and it can be difficult because then you get stuck and you spend all your energy on something that maybe nobody else in the world can even hear. Which is, you know, there's a time to place sometimes for those things, but if it comes at the expense of everything else that we need to work on, then, you know, it's a matter of prioritization. So, you know, I like to prioritize. Well, you know, I had a cello student who once said, and it's not charming when I say this, but she had a British accent, so pretty much anything she said sounded more thoughtful and charming. Anyhow, she said that she discovered she spent a lot of time working on imaginary problems. And so I asked her, what are imaginary problems? And she said, well, those are the things that you can spend a whole afternoon working on, but then in an actual performance, it doesn't even happen, or nobody notices. And so one of the ways that we can try to avoid that is to, let's say that you're doing, you know, a cello suite or something. Were you a violinist or a cellist? I don't recall.
Violin.
Violinist, okay. So you're working on these Weiss sonata or Beethoven sonata. Just perform it wherever it's at, even if it's not great. Just perform it, and then listen back to the recording and see if you can identify the biggest things that need some work on. So not, this little tiny note that isn't speaking, like the first note's just not speaking quite right. Sure, that's an issue, but you got started. And then there's this huge mass of notes that just totally got, screwed up. So maybe that is more important than the first note being absolutely pure and clean. Well, so if you go through this process of listening and identifying, like say the 3 to 5 biggest, most glaring offenses in that movement, then you start working on those. And then you perform it again maybe a few days later or the next week, and then you identify the biggest things there. And you kind of go through this list of, this is also kind of back to this iterative way of working, where you go through the biggest, most glaring things that happen, not in practice when you're going through it, but in a performance-like run-through. Because those are different things. The things that we experience in the practice room may or may not happen. The things that happen in a performance run-through, those things actually did happen. So we want to make sure that we start kind of in a performance-centric way and identify what to work on. And that will prevent you, when you have this list of, okay, these are the biggest things that I'm not pleased with, it's harder to ignore that and get stuck. The other thing you can do is set time limits. So you're actually not allowed to practice longer than, say, 8 minutes at a time, or 10 minutes. So you practice for 8 minutes, take a 2-minute break, practice again for 8 minutes, 2-minute break. You have this egg timer, like a physical timer, actually sitting on your stand, ticking down the minutes. You realize that you can't afford to spend very long on any particular thing. And if you even set a goal before you start practicing that 8 minutes, right? It's like, oh, 8 minutes I have to practice and fix this one problem. And if the goal is, okay, after 8 minutes is up, I can't keep playing it. I have to move on to another problem. That will kind of internally motivate you to make sure you try to solve that in 8 minutes so it's not left hanging. Because let's say you can't go back to it until later that day or the next day. That's going to get under your skin and bother you. So sometimes it happens. It's like, I can't find a solution to it in 8 minutes. Maybe tomorrow I'll have a solution. But for now, got to move on to the next problem. Those are a few ideas, perhaps, to help keep you from getting stuck on one note or one phrase.
Okay. I'll definitely try that. That sounds good. That sounds fun to try.
Sure.
Thank you.
I see there's a Matt on the call too. Matt, can you hear me, or would you like to ask something while you're here?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh, great. My question was about slow practice versus at tempo practice.
Yeah.
The benefits of each.
Could you tell me more about your question?
Well, there's like a big debate that I always have with a lot of people about like slow practice where you start like half tempo and you go up to full tempo on something repeatedly over like a couple weeks versus there's a new method out by Rob Knopper where it's at tempo. You do one note at a time. And I was wondering if there was any scientific backing of benefits for either, or if you had